So welcome, Dr. Christy Bird, to my motivation and cognition course. Um, Wanted to give a brief introduction to Dr. Bird. She is an assistant professor of teacher education and learning sciences at North Carolina State University. She was previously a National Science Foundation Minority Research Fellow in teacher education at Michigan State, and she received her PhD at the University of Michigan. Among her prominent works include does culturally relevant teaching work in Sage Open from 2016. But again, I'll be posting probably even more contemporary articles from Dr. Bird in the module. But with that said, welcome again. Um, and is there anything else you would like to say before we get started?
I don't know. Go ahead. Let's go ahead and get started.
All right. All right. Well, what are social-cultural influences of motivation, and why are they important for educators or education scholars?
So I think of social cultural influences, very broad. Like culture can encompass all of the assumptions and practices that we have. In my work, I really focus on what I call the school racial climate or school climate for diversity. I'm interested in how do adolescents and college students perceive what they learn about race and culture in school and the interactions among different racial groups at school. So in those types of influences, it really has to do with, what are these societal assumptions about different ethnic racial groups? How do people internalize those? How do they express them in their behaviors? And then how do schools sort of manage that, right? What do they think is appropriate to teach about race and culture? How do they actually do it? And how are they meeting students' needs or not through the kind of practices that they do? So I think it's really important for educators and educational scholars to understand because, race matters so much. A lot of people don't necessarily, race is not salient to their day-to-day lives, but it does have huge impacts on people's opportunities and the way people feel about themselves. In our society, we have, these huge disparities. And so it's important for people to be aware of those. And then you have the people who, for them, their racial identity is an important part of who they are, how they see themselves. And so for those students, it's even more important to have their racial group acknowledged in school, for them to feel like people respect them, people accept them. It's not just like, oh, well, it's okay that you're Black. It's like, no, I love that you're Black. Some of my earlier work from grad school actually focused on this interaction of your identity beliefs and the school climate. So yeah, it's important because it's important to individual people, but it's also important for our society.
Thank you for that. Could you say a little more about your own experiences conducting research on social cultural influences? Again, please feel free to provide as much detail as you'd like about the work that you do.
Sure. So I'll give you a kind of like a genealogy. So my advisors were Tabby Chavis, Stephanie Rowley, and Rob Sellers. And so in the late 90s, early 2000s, they were very well known for creating this model, the multidimensional model of racial identity. So for Black people, so they were really talking about, what is the structure of racial identity for Black people? So I came along a little while later when, this model was very popular and people were sort of trying to figure out like, okay, what is the impact of racial identity on academic outcomes? So at the time there was this debate. It's like, okay, well, if you're, really strongly identified with being Black, then, well, you think the school is acting white, or, you're going to choose your Blackness over this academic identity. And of course, my advisors were trying to push against that, but that was a really big narrative at the time. And so my early research really did get into this idea of, well, of course, it's great to be, identified with being Black and to have that strong identity. But what else is there? What are the contextual factors that might be sort of making this identification not as helpful as we would expect? And so that's where the early research on this interaction came into play. The idea is that, Okay, well, it's usually great to be strongly identified with being Black, but in certain school contexts, you're going to feel like, hey, they don't respect me, they don't like me because I have this identification, and that's going to decrease your motivation. Even if you have this great self-concept, if it's not supported in your school, then that's not going to work out for you academically or motivationally or even well-being wise. And so that's where I really got into this idea of school climate, like what is happening in the school context. So for my dissertation, I started work on the scale to measure the different aspects of school racial climate. And I won't go into like a lot of detail about that. Um, but it basically took like 5 or 6 years to come up with this sort of framework and then to have these scales that validate the framework to say there's these 10 different dimensions of school racial climate. And each of these can play out in a different way for students. So for example, there's this idea of cultural socialization. So you get these opportunities to learn about who you are at school. And that can make school more interesting. You get to learn about your history. That's the idea of culturally relevant teaching. It's all great things. So it might be good for your motivation, but it's not necessarily going to help you with like achievement necessarily. Right? So maybe something more like positive interactions in school would help you with achievement. So we could say that, if you feel like you are being treated fairly, then that's going to help you be more motivated. That's going to help you feel like you belong. And that has more direct relationships with achievement. So in my work, I've really tried to, the first part is just sort of saying like, what is there in terms of racial climate? And now trying to pick out all of the different lines to say, okay, here's how this works differently from this. This works differently from that. And then some of my even more recent work with a graduate student, Lydia Ahn, we looked at the interactions of school racial climate with what are your parents telling you about race? What kind of interactions are you having online in your neighborhood? So really getting at these multiple contexts to say, how do students' perceptions of what's happening around them influence what they experience at school?
And thank you for that. Before I get into my next question about, so my next question is going to be about, are there any practices that you're aware of that enhance educators and students' understanding of social cultural influences motivation? But before you answer that question, could you actually say a little bit more about, are there any trends that you've observed in your own research findings?
Well, my favorite outcome is belonging. So I would say that in terms of belonging, the strongest things that impact belonging are those positive interactions across racial groups. And this is true whether the school is very diverse or not that diverse. You feel good when people around you like you, when people around you aren't making fun of you because of your racial group membership, when you feel like you're being treated fairly. So I think that's probably one of the strongest effects I found. I think some of the other things is that students, adolescents, even young adolescents do notice race and culture. It's very salient to them. Obviously not to everyone, and it's an individual difference, but it is salient to them. They are able to respond about, how racist their teachers are, whether they're learning about their own culture at school. And so just to really emphasize to people that you're not gonna hurt anybody by telling kids about racism. Like it's really, they already notice it. And so what I think is the best thing to do is to really acknowledge it and give them the tools to overcome it. So another strand of my work kind of looks at this idea of critical consciousness and like, how do you turn people into just, from just accepting society into actually wanting to change society and to make it better. And that first step is really helping them to realize that there are structural inequalities. And it can, it's not always a fun process. And some of my work has found that, these critical consciousness messages can make you feel less friendly toward people who are outside of your group, right? From students of color, telling them that, white supremacy is a thing might make them feel a little bit less friendly toward the white students at their school. But I think that's a step in the process of learning, like, okay, here's how I separate institutional from the individual, and here's how I can work with my white allies to actually change those things. Yeah, so those are some things
Excellent,
that I found.
excellent points. Um, and that gets that at least gets us into that next question of are there any practices that enhance um, educators or students' understanding of social cultural influences? Um, and
Yeah.
a follow up to that question is are there practices that schools can employ to enhance learning by way of addressing social cultural influences? So what can be done?
Yeah, I think the two biggest things I would tell teachers to do is one, to talk about culture and to talk about their students' culture and to help understand, this is what your background is, this is where you came from, this is what you're, and you can think about culture broadly, right? So as a Black person, I grew up in North Carolina, and so the Black North Carolina culture is different from the Black Michigan culture, right? But there's still this sort of United States Black culture. There's a global Black community, right? And so I think helping students to appreciate what people in the past have done is really useful for helping them to understand that school is valuable and that they have something to contribute. One of the things I learned in college was that Egypt was in Africa, right? And it seems kind of silly, but to me, all of my schooling up until college had really been this focus on, okay, well, Egypt was this ancient society, blah, blah, and then nothing happened in Africa until the slave trade, right? And it wasn't until college where I started to learn, and even in grad school, I learned even more about some of the societies that were in Africa. And just how that left me with this impression of like, well, Black people haven't really done anything. When in fact, those societies were very advanced and had all kinds of achievements that we've just forgotten and haven't told children about. So even in my own personal life, it's like I've seen this like idea that just learning about your own culture is super, super important. But again, I think even for people from other races, for them to learn about that culture is really helpful for them to see me, as someone who is smart and valuable and is worthy. And then I think the second thing is to really teach that critical consciousness, like I was talking about, to say, okay, why don't we know very much about Africa and what all those societies were like before the slave trade? Is because of white supremacy, right? And so helping students, even, you can talk about fairness with, even like middle schoolers, helping them to analyze their society, to say, look, there are these differences, more Black folks live on this corner than on this corner. And, these are the kids who go to the really fancy school, and these are the kids who go to the school where, they can't take their books home. Why do you think that is? Let's look at the history of our town. Let's look at the history of the United States. To really question, we see a society as it is, but how did it get to be that way? I think those are really important questions, because we can't fix that unless we actually know what the causes are. So those are some practices. And then I think that, in terms of best practices, is we don't exactly know. Like, there's a lot of great resources out there about how to incorporate these kinds of ideas into your teaching. There's a whole field of culturally relevant teaching, which is one of ones I was trying to speak to in that 2015 article. I think it was 2016 article. But a lot of that work isn't necessarily like psychological. A lot of it's more sort of like, okay, here's some teachers that are doing great things, do what they do. There's not the analysis of like, okay, well, how does this practice affect this student with these kinds of beliefs, this students with these kinds of identities, this students with these kinds of experiences? So the kind of direction I'm taking right now is looking at diversity courses in particular, and these courses that are designed to sort of fulfill these requirements of enhancing people's critical consciousness at least a little bit, and trying to say, okay, what are students' motivations throughout these courses? How is that impacted by the students' identities and values going into the course? What happens when the teacher notices their motivation dropping? Has the teacher intervene? And really trying to track that over time through the assignments, and see if we can come up with some models that say, hey, these are the kinds of activities that are most useful for these kinds of people. These are the kinds of ways that the instructor can respond when they notice certain types of reactions happening. That's kind of my next 10-year goal, is to say, okay, here's how to teach the perfect diversity course.
I'll look forward to that. Well, like, so going into my next question, I want to say a little bit more about my students in this course. So a lot of them are in education, but I also have graduate students who are coming to us from nutrition, nursing, or other clinical oriented professions. And so I'll change my next question a little bit to ask, can your expertise apply to settings outside of education or beyond education? So your work on critical consciousness, how can it be applied beyond education? What does it mean for motivation, again, outside of educational settings?
Yeah, I mean, I think that every adult, every child too, needs to learn how to function in a diverse society. And then a lot of companies, a lot of organizations now are really trying to increase their anti-racism. They're trying to make sure that their workplaces are places where people feel really safe and comfortable. And so, I think my work directly translates to those kinds of settings. Obviously, schools are kind of a unique setting where it's like you're kind of trapped there for however many hours a day, and you go through these grades and things like that. But a lot of the interpersonal dynamics are similar. Certainly the beliefs about race that people bring in are the same. And so I work on 2 projects right now that are kind of trying to do this extension. So one is a podcast and blog called #PasToMikeYouth, where it's some NC States, our wonderful NC State hosts who are running the podcast. So they interview young activists. They interview people who are, and these are, some of these are like high school students to really talk about how do they do activism in their daily lives. And with that podcast, what we've created is this framework to say, this is what critical positive youth development looks like. And it looks like telling your story. It looks like being able to engage with people around transforming society. And then another project I'm working with is to help an organization that actually does these kinds of diversity trainings outside of schools with organizations to say, like, what kind of measures are you using? Are they working? Let me help you to prove that what you're doing is good and valuable. So those are the most direct ways that I've extended my work. I think that, I've done some workshops for the community. I did a implicit bias workshop with my church way back in California. I just try and get the idea out there that, like, let's talk about these things. It's hard work. It's not always going to feel comfortable. It's not always going to be nice. But it's so worth it in the end to feel that sense of like, yeah, we're doing something for society.
Right, and thank you. Could you repeat the hashtag?
Yeah, #PasToMikeYouth.
All right.
So anywhere you get your podcasts is where we are. We also have a website, PasToMikeYouth.com, where we have resources for educators. And we have a little parents corner now too. So yeah.
Thank you. And we're arriving at my final question here, which is there anything you would like for my students to know about your research or advice about motivation in general?
I think that the biggest thing, and this has kind of been a theme since I came to NC State, one of the biggest things about motivation research that always kind of turned me off is that they don't necessarily pay attention to those social cultural aspects of it. You can be at a motivation conference and they're just talking about, values and expectancies. And, they'll mention the race of the participants in the methods section, and that's about it. But, my work has always been very strongly about motivation. That's my favorite outcome, because it's about, it's about who you are and like what you want to do and what you enjoy in the world. And I think that everyone should enjoy school. So that's kind of my motivation. But I haven't always found a place in the motivation world. And so I would say that being at NC State has been a real boon because we have people like DeLeon Gray and Jessica Queer-Gumby who are leaders in combining motivation with these social cultural aspects. And they are leaders in changing the field. Like, so now motivation is paying a lot more attention to these kind of variables. And so I think that, you know, I would just give you hope to say that if this is your area of research, if this is what you want to do, then go ahead and do it. There are people who will appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for joining me in my class on this conversation. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's really cool. Thank you.
All right. I will go ahead and end the recording here.
Okay.